Welcome to the Build Beyond podcast, where we challenge and guide so that you can meet your full potential. Welcome to the first episode of the Build Beyond podcast. My name is Chris Netley. I'm your host. Today I have a beautiful co-host, my wife, Marissa Netley. Marissa, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We wanted to start off with this first intro episode discussing the name and the purpose of the podcast.
Can you tell everybody a little bit about where we got the name Build Beyond?
Build Beyond came through many conversations between Marissa and I, and actually the name was her idea. There's a quite literal meaning to the name. I am a chiropractor, and specifically I have a board certification in chiropractic sports medicine. So the literal meaning of Build Beyond with an athlete would be to build them back beyond their expectations. Most athletes would come see me if they have an injury or if they're dealing with pain. I don't exclusively see athletes, though. Actually, primarily I see just general population, but I use the same principles with the general population as I would with athletes. So we build people beyond their expectations. We build strength, we build confidence, we can build endurance, we build health, you name it, we build it. And if we need to build in a direction that is outside of my scope of practice, I connect people with other providers or professionals who can help build them beyond their expectations. Although that's really not where the name came from. So originally, when we were discussing what we wanted to name this project, we started talking about my dad, and that's really where all of this originated. My dad died 5 weeks after he was diagnosed with cancer. And that was a very quick turnaround. And obviously he didn't get cancer. And then 5 weeks later, it progressed and he died. He had cancer for quite some time. And, at that time, I was not a healthcare provider. So I didn't recognize the signs or symptoms, and none of us really did. Now, I have his medical records, and looking back at them and looking at pictures of him and just talking to different people about conversations and interactions they had with him, it was pretty obvious, or it should have been pretty obvious, that he had cancer. Specifically, he had metastatic lung cancer. And by the time he was diagnosed, it had spread to his spinal cord and his brain. So he didn't have much time. And looking back at it, I'm not upset at any of his healthcare providers. I think there's the realistic possibility that he would have died on the same day, regardless of what had happened. So I'm not saying that we could have saved him, but it is frustrating to lose someone so quickly and watched him fade quickly with very little hope. And that was a very frustrating thing to go through, and it's still difficult. It was years ago. But I think about my dad a lot, and I think about him most often in clinic or when I'm working with patients. I think about my dad, when I get a lot of low back pain. When I've seen my 20th low back pain patient of the week, there is that temptation to just kind of go through the motions. And I'm able to not do that with patients because of thinking about my dad, because I think about him going to his healthcare providers and them not being on their A game. He is, or has been, since I've been a doctor, my motivation to treat everyone like an individual, to treat people, like give people the type of care that I would want to receive, or that I would want Marissa, I'd want you to receive, or our kids to receive, or my mom to receive, or just anyone I care about. So he still serves as that motivation. So when we were thinking about names for projects like this, literally I wanted to call it Phil. It's my dad's first name, and Marissa talked me out of it. So we had to start brainstorming on what we would call it. Like, what's the name that would, for people who knew my dad or trying to remember my dad, what would make them think about him? My dad was a carpenter. It was really an all-around handyman. He could fix and build anything, not just with wood, but with machines. And he didn't really like fancy titles. I think he would have been most comfortable with being just called a builder, because that's what he did. And my dad had a reputation for building things beyond the expectations. He was not cheap, but you got way more than what you paid for. And he did a lot of large scale projects, but he would do smaller things as well. And there was just this general sense of awe when he finished a project.
I know he did a lot of really large scale projects like building staircases and, massive things for foams and things like that. But I feel like even in like the tiniest little projects, like he gave us some gifts for our wedding that he had made out of wood that, you know, were beautiful, but on a much, much smaller scale. And he wanted them to be perfect, right? I think he had like 6 prototypes of this little box that he made us, to just make it perfect and go way above and beyond. And for us, it didn't matter. I mean, I have no background in that industry or in that craft, but it was something where he could see the potential of how meticulous and beautiful something could be, even in kind of the smallest projects, which most people wouldn't probably spend as much time and energy as he did on those types of things too. So it didn't matter. It was the level that he wanted to live up to, regardless of the type of project he was working on, which was a testament, I think, of how he approached life too, right? It wasn't just his work. It was everything in his life. He was very intentional, which was very powerful.
He crossed every T and dotted every I multiple times, and if he
Mm-hmm.
didn't like the way it looked, he would redo it. He was so detail oriented, and there was a pride there. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, like if you could take his attention to detail and his commitment to excellence, and you could translate that into a healthcare provider, he would have been the best doctor. You know what I mean? So it's almost like an inhuman level of perfection. Like, and he did not get that same level of detail or care from, I would say, any of his healthcare providers within the last couple of years. And that's, again, not to blame them and to suggest that they're bad healthcare providers. There is a very realistic possibility that some of them witnessed and noticed the signs and symptoms and probably maybe have said something to him. But the bottom line is like they still took his money. They still billed his insurance.
Mm-hmm.
No one was enough of a leader to really guide him and challenge him and be like, look, we got to get this taken care of. We have to figure out why you're experiencing these things. They just looked at him through a lens of their own specialty and what they could bill for. And that sounds really harsh. And again, I'm not trying to put down other healthcare providers because I understand how hard it can be, especially when you've seen 100 patients that week. Maybe you've seen 100 patients that day. You know what I mean? Like, depending on the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenges of being a healthcare provider, those are real. And rather than being mad and blaming these other healthcare providers, I more so feel sorry because they missed an opportunity. If I gave this case to any student who's going through a differential diagnosis course in grad school, they would nail it. Like, I wouldn't even need to
Mm-hmm.
give them multiple choice. But students are being trained to look at all of the factors and they have time. And I feel like as a healthcare provider, you don't have time and you tend to just gravitate towards your specialty. So that's where the name came from. It, to me, when I to most people, when they hear build beyond, they're going to think of that first definition, building their health and building all these other things, and that's great. To me, when I think about it, I just think about my dad. So and everything else is just secondary to that. So that's
Mm-hmm.
where the name came from. So thank you for not letting me call it Phil.
Well, I think there's pros and cons to a name like that. But um, I think with the idea of building something, you also have had the thought when we were coming up with it very late one night after the kids went to bed. Um, you had the thought about, you're building something together, right? You're building something with a patient. You're building something not as you, the doctor, but you as the patient and the doctor together. And to me, that's super powerful because it's it's a forward motion that you're both trying to achieve, right? It's a forward um, goal that you're both trying to accomplish. And I think sometimes you don't, as a patient, you don't always get that from every doctor. But um, I think that, building on what exists today or what you have as a patient and looking at the positives and figuring out how to go to get better, but then also go beyond just getting better, right? You might have some pain and you might be able to alleviate that pain, but what's beyond that, right? Like how can we become better humans? How can we, go beyond just like maybe shoulder pain, back pain, whatever it might be? How can we be better human beings by thinking about our health, thinking about all aspects of our life because it's all connected too. And so I think
Mhm.
it's just really really powerful. And yeah, I'm excited about the name, and excited about where this is going to go. So we are here on a podcast. Can you talk a little bit about the purpose of the podcast, what this is going to look like, types of people that you're going to invite on here?
To build on your the healthcare provider. I don't technically build anything, and I think that's a big maybe like a big philosophical shift is that like when people come see me, I'm not doing a whole lot, empowering them to the best of my ability. The purpose of the podcast is really the purpose of what I do. It's really to challenge and guide people so that they can meet their full potential. And it's that simple. It's the challenge and the guidance again that I don't feel like my dad got. That challenge and that guidance, that's really what the whole reason behind this.
And how did you get to that, right? Because I feel like that's a very profound statement. And obviously, you didn't just come up with that on the fly, right?
Well, I've been living it, I guess, to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent, and then this is just putting words to it.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, my practice has just evolved and it's changed. And the purpose of this podcast is really just putting words to the way I feel and the way I already operate. Um, and I think the follow on would be like, okay, that sounds great, but like, how does that actually work?
Mm-hmm.
And it works by questioning everything. Like we dig deeper, we're curious about everything. Again, I look back and I would love to have been a fly on the wall for some of those doctor visits with my dad, but like, how many questions did they really ask him? Like, how curious were they? Or they were just trying to move on to the next patient? No one really dug that deep until he went to the ER and finally got diagnosed. And I can only imagine how hard it was for that physician, you know what I mean, that evening or early morning to realize that he had a terminal patient or she had a terminal patient.
Mm-hmm.
So we question everything, and that's the one beautiful thing about this podcast is I get to ask a lot of questions. We're gonna have a lot of great guests on. Another thing that we do is we really embrace flexibility. If you're going to seek improvement, you have to acknowledge the fact that you're probably wrong if you're trying to grow, but you're just trying to be, less wrong. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to move along. And if you're so rigid and you think that you're always right, you become static and you're not adapting. Another thing we do is we're trying to appreciate the value of discomfort. Physical pain can oftentimes, I mean, it's been said by many different people, it's a request for change. So hardships can be extremely beneficial if they lead to growth. And I think a lot of times when people are dealing with pain or health issues, it's seen as this huge burden, and I completely understand why. But can we look at it as an opportunity to grow? And the answer is yes for most people. Discomfort can be rewarding if you can overcome the challenges, right? So we try to embrace that. And the last thing is, I mean, we really just hold ourselves accountable. I mean, what you allow is what will continue. And that's been said in a lot of different ways. But I love that quote. And we used to say something very similar to that when I was in the Marines. And you know, if you want things to change, you have to change, right? At least you have to be open to change.
Mhm.
And a lot of people go through life in pain or with poor health or not accomplishing what they want to accomplish because they're not holding themselves accountable. And that's not a negative thing. It's just a reality of being a human. It's such a human experience. But once we can start to say that, like, okay, I have control, um, what can what can I do? Like, what's the
Mhm.
next step? And you just take it step by step. And you just have to acknowledge that there are consequences for your words and for your actions, and there are consequences for lack of words and lack of actions. So, um, holding ourselves accountable, although that sounds harsh, is actually, it makes you free in a way because it gives you the power to change. You know, because
I
if
feel
you,
like for a lot of people, though, change is really hard. Like people don't like to necessarily change unless they have to. Um, I think it's just human nature, right?
it's not just hard for some people, it's hard for everybody. And so if you're out there and you're like, it's hard for me to change, like, that is, welcome to being a human. Everybody, you know what I mean? Like, some people are better adapted to
Yeah.
it, to change, than others.
Hmm.
And that's from a variety of reasons, but no one wants to do the hard stuff.
Hmm.
And that's the benefit of, hopefully, this podcast. It's the benefit of having a healthcare provider or a team of healthcare providers. It, what we're really trying to do is create a team environment. People need to feel supported, and they need to have a sounding board, and they need to have options. So, in clinic, that's what I try and do, is create this team environment. Again, I'm not building, I'm guiding. The person is their own builder, and that's what makes it sustainable. So ideally, this podcast is going to give people a bunch of resources. Ideally, it'll inspire, it'll motivate. People will feel challenged, and there will be some guidance there to help move people along, at least towards whatever goals they're trying to achieve. There was an idea of overwhelming a problem with an excellent solution. And if you think about every problem out there, there is a solution to it for the most part. What is that excellent solution? And if you can't do that 100%, well, what percentage can you do? Because even if you could, even if you can just do 1%, you're still moving in the right direction. And we can build on that. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just have to make some type of progress.
Yeah, I feel like there's something that you have given me advice on in the past, which is it doesn't all have to happen all at once, too, right? You don't have to have that change all in one day or all in one week or all in one year. It's just like one bite at a time. You always say like, what's the best way to eat an elephant? It's like one bite at a time. And I think about that pretty often because I'm like many, an impatient person. I think I want things to happen overnight and they don't always do, right? Um, or, if you hit the gym for a week and nothing changes, you get frustrated, just as an example. But I feel like if you're thinking about that a little bit differently and you have the right plan in place and solution you're striving towards and you chip away at it slowly with the right guidance, you can accomplish your goals and get where you need to be. But okay, so already talking to a handful of people about coming on here as a guest. Can you give a little tease of who and what topic will be coming soon?
Coming soon, we're going to dive into nutrition because this is not my field of expertise. I know enough to guide people, but we're going to bring in an expert, Denise Lovinger, who's a registered dietitian in our local area. She's got decades of experience, private practice, working in hospitals, you name it. She is a wealth of information and just a wonderful person. We're going to start a whole, over probably the next year, a whole discussion on everything nutrition and break those up into little episodes. Other than that, I've got some really interesting ideas that I haven't asked the people yet, but I'm gonna actually use this initial episode, um, to send it out to some people and get some new guests on, because something I'd really like to dive into is youth physical fitness, and the importance of physical fitness for pediatric patients.
And where can people find us? Where can people find you? How can people get in touch with you?
I am on pretty much every social media platform at Chris Netley DC. So I'm mostly on Instagram, but I have a Twitter account, or X now, Facebook, and I have a YouTube channel again at Chris Netley DC. You can go to my website, chrisnetley.com, and Build Beyond has a website now. So it is buildbeyondhealth.com. You can go there and submit your email if you want to get email updates about the podcast and just different developments with the Build Beyond brand.